I attended a Syro-Malabar Catholic church for the first time as a traditional Catholic, and this is what I saw. So, I recently attended a Syro-Malabar Catholic church for the first time as a trad Cath because I wanted to see what it was like as a option for Catholics faithful to tradition. It was an overall positive experience. People there were nice and friendly. As far as so for anything I want to say going forward, either critical or positive, I want to give due credit where it's due. They were very welcoming, very kind, etc. Got a blessed candle because the bishop was visiting, was blessing candles, and I thought I would examine their liturgy from a traditional Catholic standpoint and discuss how they measure up. So, as many of you might know, there are other rites aside from the Latin rite in the Catholic Church. That is why, contrary to popular opinion, it's not just about the traditional Latin Mass. It's one of the reasons why I think of liturgy as one of my least concerning issues as a traditional Catholic. I'm more of a doctrinal traditionalist. Secondly, there have been are problems in the Eastern Rite churches as well. And even though a lot of Trackouts do and have gone to Eastern Rite churches as a way to get away from the bad liturgy and modernism in Novus Ordo parishes, because Eastern Rite parishes are seen as being less insane than Western Novus Ordo parishes, and this is largely true. And they tend to, and it tends to vary from rite between rites. So, for example, I've been to Eastern liturgies that are kind of like Robert Novus Ordo, and I've been to Eastern liturgies that are honestly more like the traditional Latin Mass. So, but even when you go, when you go to these liturgies, there are things that are simply culture shock. They aren't anti-traditional, but they are culture shocks. And I wanted to discuss how the Syro-Malabars measured up because hey, is it? Let's see if this is a good option. Is this a bad option? Is it just like an Indian Novus Ordo? Is it more like the traditional Latin Mass? Is this something that we as trad Caths could attend as an option if we don't have the traditional Latin Mass in the area? So, without further ado, let me describe what I saw let me describe what my experiences were at going to a Syro-Malabar Mass for the first time. So, I live in a rural area, but despite this, about 20 minutes away from where I live, I found out there is a twice a month Syro-Malabar Catholic mission. The priest comes in, and so I decided I would go down and check it out. Because as a Novus Ordo non-attendee, I'm starved for the sacraments. Let's be honest. So I showed up. So I showed up early. I went in after the Novus Ordo Mass ended and prayed for about an hour, and I was expecting Mass to be at 11 o'clock. Because that is where people in the WhatsApp group told me that's when it would start. Fun fact, punctuality is very much a Western European thing. It is not it is in East Indian culture, it does not appear to be a major issue. Mass was 40 minutes late getting started. I think the only time I've ever been at Mass that was that late getting started was actually at an SSPX Mass because the line for confession was so long. And even though there were only like 30 people, everyone went to confession before Mass. Now, the priest showed up. He was gracious and kind enough to hear my confession. If you're watching this, Father, thank you so much. Means the world to me. And so further ado, they were gathering. They were starting to get ready for Mass. They had set up this podium in the middle. That's where the priest would face the people. And they had a crucifix, a cross, a Syro-Malabar cross on it. And they're also getting ready for like a little bit of procession procession before Mass because the bishop was visiting and they're doing 2 baptisms that day for 2 young children. So anyway, one of the things that would startle most traditional Catholics about attending a Syro-Malabar Mass is the music. It is definitely very East Indian in flavor. It would it would it would strike a lot of traditional Catholics as sounding, and I've actually listened to like the Syro-Malabar and other Orthodox liturgies, i.e. the Eastern the Orthodox counterparts of the Syro-Malabar Church. That rhythmic style is part of the rite, legitimately. So, but it would sound very much almost like if you imagine someone to do an Indian style Novus Ordo Mass instead of a typical Indian chant. That's what it would kind of sound like to them. But it is legitimately part of their rite. That is legitimately how they do chanting. Copts use cymbals and drums and triangles in their Mass. They have a way of doing it that makes it work. So the priests, they had 2 priests and the bishop that process to the altar. And for the first part of the liturgy, the Corbana, as it is termed in the Syro-Malabar Rite, it kind of reminded me a bit of the Novus Ordo in a certain sense. That part of the liturgy did. Keep watching to the end because there's a lot more. So the liturgy was done facing the that part of the first part of the liturgy, the Mass, as we would call it, the Mass of catechumens, Novus Ordo is the liturgy of the word, was done facing the people, doing the readings, etc. There was a lot of chants and litanies. In some ways, I thought at the moment that it's reminding me of the Prayer of the Faithful, but then I remember from my experience with Byzantine liturgies that there are a lot of litanies for petitions in the Byzantine rite as well. And it's not just endless craziness. So that's something that was different between rites as well. There are a lot of references, and I looked at the liturgy was done entirely, and I mean entirely, in Malayalam. I couldn't even find a missal that had an English translation. So I was praying for my missal as I was doing it, which basically is what I would do at a traditional at Mass, if I'm honest with you. And I was able to follow along. The structure across rites is actually very basic. You have a sign of the cross, some sort of penitential rite generally, penitential prayers. You have scripture readings and the sermon. Maybe some rites they have litanies. They'll say, not so much in the Latin rite, but that was more or less the structure that it followed. And I looked at some of the translations later on, and there were some of the translations later that I looked up later on, found out that there were a lot of references to sacrifice in the Mass as a sacrifice in the first part of the liturgy. Anyway, after the sermon began, the Mass of the Faithful, or as Novus Ordo Catholics call it, the Liturgy of the Eucharist began. What was special about this part and what I loved is that they celebrated Mass ad orientem, and the priests were vested in proper liturgical vestments. It was like ornate gold vestments. Like they're vested in think of a cope. Think of a very ornate cope that a priest or bishop might wear before a solemn high Mass. That was what the vestments of the priest looked like as they celebrated Mass. It would be similar, like similar vestments to the Maronite rite, is my best comparison, if anyone's familiar with that. And they celebrated Mass ad orientem, which is something that's incredibly unique that rather surprised me. Normally, my non-Byzantine Masses that I usually attend would be the Maronites, who celebrate Mass versus populum, basing the people. So this is something I really liked. I was pleasantly surprised to find this. One of the things, however, I did not really care for would be that it seemed to be that communion and the hand was the way most people received Holy Communion. Now, I'm not totally familiar. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on the history of the Syro-Malabar rite. I know a little bit. That being said, I know that some of the Syro-Malabars are descendants from converted Nostarians, essentially rejoined the church. And some of the rites, I notably Syro-Malankara rite, I think is much more recent. As far as a rite within the church goes, it's them coming to the church is much more recent. Syro-Malabars are much older, if I recall correctly. If I understand, there was an Nostarian influence there, and they are trying to undo centuries of excessive Latinization. At one point, the Syro-Malabar rite was essentially they would do the traditional Latin Mass in Malayan. It was considered extremely Latinized, something that should not have been done. Pius XI said the same thing. So part of me is wondering if communion of the hand may have been an accidental carryover, especially with quasi-Novostro influence from that time period, because I've noticed most of the churches throughout the world, even Orthodox counterparts, do communion on the tongue, and I have noticed a parallel that churches that do communion in the hand have a history of, in some ways, diminishing the divinity of Christ as both God and man. Not necessarily Arian, but if it's Christ's body and Christ's divinity is separated from his body, why is it as sacred? Is a certain. And combined with Novus Ordo allowing communion of the hand under that influence, it was a de-Latinization that should not have happened. St. Thomas Aquinas forbade communion on the hand in his work, the Summa Theologica. That being said, they did give communion to infants, which is a very traditional Eastern Rite thing, and there was no issue with me receiving on the tongue whatsoever. It was quite a long liturgy. Again, this was a pontifical mass Qurbana I was at, with the bishop visiting. So my personal guess is that if the bishop hadn't been there, if they weren't doing 2 baptisms that day, it probably would have been like an hour. Typical length of time for what you expect. Also, I would notice that there were a lot of women who were veiling. It was almost comparable to what you would expect at like a very conservative Novus Ordo parish, or even the traditional Latin Mass in that regard. So, my honest opinion, would I go back to the Syro-Malabars if I ever had to or got the chance? My honest answer to that would be yes. I honestly would, and I would certainly recommend it to anyone who is, especially if you're already attending the Novus Ordo and you're watching this, like you're gonna feel way more at home at the Syro-Malabar Mass, way more leaps and bounds. Just because it's gonna be a bit of a culture shock between like Western versus East Indian culture, but that's about it. It's far more reverent. The vestments are far more reverent. The Mass sub ad orientem, and the criticism I have would be the communion on the hand, which may be an accidental de-Latinization. It's probably an accidental de-Latinization that honestly should have stayed one of the few things that should have stayed Latinized, because of my personal theory is possible old Nostarian influence. So, but yeah, like you're gonna be fine. You find a Syro-Malabar church liturgy quite comfortable, and if you can't struggling to follow along with the liturgy, Malayan is the traditional liturgical language of the church as well. You can find translations to the Mass online, or you could do what I did: just take your Sunday Latin Mass Missal and pray it through the various parts of the Malayan Mass. So honestly, positive experience with the Syro-Malabars. Got a nice candle out of it. But anyway, if you ever get a chance to check out one, highly recommend it. It's one of my top tier traditional liturgies. I'm torn with the in between preferring them or the Maronites. I've had a choice, if I'm honest with you. On one hand, the Maronites are much stronger with communion on the tongue versus the hand. That being said, that's more common practice in the parish. Communion of the hand is, unfortunately, more and more frequent among the Maronites, though communion on the tongue seems to be the norm among the Maronites, though they celebrate Masses versus Populum. When it comes to the Syro-Malabars, communion on the hand seems to be the norm, unfortunately. That means that they celebrate Mass versus Populum, but they will receive communion on the tongue. And they do celebrate the Mass ad orientem. But anyway, if you're a Novus Ordo Catholic, or if you're a Trads who still attends the Novus Ordo for the sacraments, and you hear the Syro-Malabar Mass, like, you're going to be way happier at a Syro-Malabar Mass than the Novus Ordo. Anyway, God bless. Have a great day. And if you ever get a chance to check out an SSPX Mass or Syro-Malabar Mass, make sure you get the chance. God bless.